Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to this virtual event on incentives for responsible investment in agriculture and food systems. Before we start, I would like to remind those who participate in these events that there is interpretation available. In the toolbar at the bottom, you can choose Spanish or French, in addition to English, which is going to be the floor language. Please be aware that the event is going to be recorded. And if you have a question, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, it's clearly stated there, and specify your name and affiliation. And please feel free to send comments in the chat box and use the all panelists and attendees. So let's start. Investment in agri-food systems must increase to reduce food insecurity and improve nutrition, and for agriculture to adapt to climate change. This means that this investment must be responsible. And now the question is, how can we boost responsible investment? My name is Pedro Arias. I am an economist working for the FAO Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia, and I will be moderating this event. This event is the result of a joint effort by the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, which I will refer to as CCSI, and the FAO. And we will be exploring the potential of incentives to boost responsible investment. The event is divided into two sessions. During the first session, we will hear from three presenters their views of some of the key elements that we should take into account to tackle this issue. They have recently published, together with other authors, a guide on incentives for responsible investment in agriculture and food systems. Here again, a joint effort of the FAO and CCSI. In the second session, two presenters will share with us their experiences of good practices on how incentives can generate sustainable investment. We will end this event with closing remarks from Lorenzo Cutula. Lorenzo is the principal researcher in law and sustainable development at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED. And I will also take the liberty of making some closing remarks. But before we go into these sessions, I would like to invite three distinguished guests. They will set the scene for the discussions. First, Mr. Thanawat Tenzin is a permanent representative of Thailand to the UN agencies in Rome. Then we have Beth Bethel, Deputy Director General of the FAO, and Lisa Sachs, the Director of the CCSI. We will begin with Mr. Tenzin, who is also chairperson of the UN Committee on World Food Security, or CFS. His work covers a wide range of technical areas from crop to livestock, food safety, and international trade. Mr. Tenzin, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for your introduction. Very good evening from Bangkok, Thailand, and also good afternoon to all of you in Rome and elsewhere around the world. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizer for the invitation. Excellency, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here today to participate in these joint events of FAO and the Columbia Centers for Sustainable Development, as this is a crucial topic for the work of the Committee on World Food Security, CFS, and also for the achievements of SDG 2. Increased responsible investment in agriculture and food system from both private sectors and public sectors is critical to enhancing food security and nutrition, reducing poverty, and responding to climate change. This is very well illustrated in the FAO guide on incentive for responsible investment and in agriculture and food system. And some of you may have seen the guide. I have seen it recently and it looks very well. And I know that once you read it, you will know that how to use the guide to be translated into action at the country level. Because guide is the book, guide is just a document. Once you read it, you need to implement, you need to adapt, and you need to make sure that all the guide is really used and utilized for the national strategies, for the national action plan, to make sure that we can make an impact on ground. And that's why the FAO guide on incentive, which we appreciate and welcome as a crucial tools for this area. Let me commend FAO and its partners for their continuous work to translate the negotiated CFS principle for responsible investment in agriculture and food systems, so-called RIE principle, into meaningful actions on the ground at the regional, national, and local levels. This topic is very complex. I think all of you know that when we're talking about incentive, it's always not easy for implementation, and also it involves many actors and is highly political. I remember when I worked in my countries, when we are talking among the government agencies, private sectors, civil societies, and farmers about incentive, about responsible investment, it's always come with the difficult situation to make decision. But anyway, I would like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation for your relentless effort to chip away at these issues by, among other things, developing useful, targeted guidance and tools for development actors and members. In the capacities of the CFS chairperson, I would like to highlight the greatest degree of legitimacy of the CFS principle for responsible investment in agriculture and food system, given that they have been negotiated by a broad range of actors, including government agencies, civil societies, private sectors organization, and then the principle were anonymously endorsed by CFS members, and call upon all of you to recommit to promoting those principles, especially in the context of the upcoming UN Food System Summits and other appropriate venues. Principles are meaningless if they are not visible, if they are not respected, and they are not applied. Just like recognitions and respect for the right to adequate food and other relevant human rights. We have invested our time, energy, and resources to produce, discuss, negotiate, and endorse the principles. And also today we have a new guide for incentive. I take this opportunity to inform you that the CFS will soon launch an open and public monitoring exercise to collect experiences and good practices on the use and application of the CFS RIE principle at the CFS 50 plenary session in October next year. During that plenary, we will hold a global thematic event on the CFS RIE principles, and I count on your support to share those experiences and drive further use and awareness. We hope this promotion of the CFS RIE principle go hand in hand with effort to promote the CFS VGGT and increase effort on land tenure and government. And also, as all of you know, that the early of this year, the CFS just adopted the voluntary guideline on food system and nutrition. And just only the beginning of this month, on 4th of June, the CFS and its members just adopted the policy recommendation on agroecological and other innovative approach. And all the policy products will be meaningful once it's applied and used at the local, at the country level to ensure the global impact and outcome. So we look forward to working with you to increase and strengthen responsible investment in agriculture and food system, and welcome your ideas, creativities on how we can support each other in this area. And all of you are the one who can bring the concept into action at the ground level, at the country level, and then we will see the better outcome and result at the global level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tilson. And I'm glad that you mentioned the CFS RIE principles. Actually, the team at the time that I worked for represented the FAO during the negotiations. And I do remember, as you rightly said, is a political process. Thank you. Next, I would like to invite Ms. Beth Bessel, Deputy Director of the FAO. She's responsible for partnerships and outreach, including UN collaboration, resource mobilization, private sector partnerships, and South-South and triangular cooperation. She leads programs in the area of plant production and protection and oversees the work of the FAO Committee on Agricultural COAC and of the Secretariat of the International Plant Protection Convention, IPPC. Beth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and thank you, Ambassador Tilson, for being with us today. Lisa, to you and the colleagues at CCSI for this outstanding collaboration, and to everyone who is here to be a part of this really important discussion. I'm really pleased to be able to join this event in which we will take a close look on how we can use various types of incentives to ensure that investments in agriculture are indeed responsible and sustainable. I have just a couple of key thoughts to maybe contribute to the conversation, and I think to probably amplify even a number of the comments that Ambassador Tilson has made on responsible investments in agriculture and food systems. First, I think it's always important to remind ourselves why investment today, in this very time, in food and agriculture is so critical. We want to end hunger and poverty. We want to drive sustainable development, and we want to build back better. That's a pretty long list and a pretty grand set of challenges that all of us face together. And if we are to achieve this, we must facilitate private investments in the agri-food sector. And I think very importantly, small, medium-sized enterprises have a particularly important role to play and should be encouraged and incentivized to play that role. But what is especially crucial is that these investments be made responsibly. The agri-food sector, just to remind ourselves, is one of 10 SDG priority areas for investment. And it has huge potential to help eradicate poverty and hunger, drive sustainable growth, and ultimately provide decent employment. The world is facing its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, all because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the number of the extremely poor and undernourished has increased dramatically. Millions of workers and small-scale entrepreneurs have lost their jobs, their livelihoods, and we know that women and youth have been hit particularly hard. Concerted efforts then to increase investment in agriculture and food systems are needed now, more than ever before, to stimulate the kinds of inclusive economic growth that are needed and to ultimately build more resilient societies and communities. And so it is critical that all of these investments are fully aligned with the SDGs and are made in responsible frameworks. The CFS RIE principles are absolutely a key tool for ensuring this. These principles are the first global agreement on what constitutes responsible investment in the agri-food sector. And adhering to these and promoting these with private sector actors will be fundamental to ensuring that we achieve not only more investment, but that we ultimately make better investments. FAO continues to work closely with all stakeholders to improve these enabling environments in applying the principles at country level. There was very important dialogue and conversation about the importance of the RIE principles and responsible investments in agriculture, specifically in our recent discussions with members and all different types of outside stakeholders and partners in developing FAO's own new strategy for future engagement with the private sector. And I was very encouraged to see, again, the openness and the willingness for discussions around the applicability, the advocacy, and the education around these principles in the formulation of that strategy. The second message to convey today is about incentives. Strategic interventions from the public sector will play a vital role in driving responsible private investments into agri-food systems. Targeted investment incentives can be even more powerful and more catalytic in encouraging more and better investments. So it is essential that these incentives respond to actual needs, particularly to those of investors who are often marginalized, such as domestic, small, medium-sized enterprises, small-scale producers, and again, youth and women. And finally, we need to be very practical about how we do this. How can policymakers and technical government staff and leaders strategically use public resources via incentives that stimulate responsible private sector investments for sustainable development? To contribute to that, you've already heard reference, but we're very pleased today to be able to officially launch together the FAO and CCSI guide on incentives for responsible investment in agriculture and food systems, a practical handbook with practical recommendations for parliamentarians, policymakers, and other national leaders. It gives me great pleasure, alongside Lisa and Ambassador Tenzin and so many others, to officially launch this guide today, even though I know it has already been made available to all of you through electronic channels, has been promoted via social media, but we do consider this very event as the official launch of this important piece of work, available in English, French, and Spanish. In closing, I want to again thank the ambassador for his great leadership as the chair of the Committee on World Food Security and his continued outstanding support and appreciation of the progress that we have made at FAO with so many of our partners. I want to thank CCSI for its longstanding collaboration, supporting the implementation of the CFS RIE and the launch of today's guide. And finally, I want to thank all of our panelists representing government, investment promotion agencies, associations, and research institutes. It takes all of us to advance really difficult issues and action-oriented plans like this. And your contributions in all of this and participation in today's event is very welcomed. I look forward to the further discussion, and thank you again for all of the continued support. And FAO stands ready to continue to engage with so many of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, for your inspiring thoughts in terms of looking back at the SDGs. I think this is something we always have to keep in mind. This is what we do in the FAO, right? We're trying to contribute to the SDGs, and we have a particular angle that we want to convey in our work. And last but not least, Lisa. Lisa Sachs is the director of the CCSI, the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment. She specializes in extractive industries, foreign investment, corporate responsibility, human rights, and integrated economic development. She has developed a robust research portfolio on extractive industries, investment in agriculture, including land investments, and investment in investment law and policy. She has also overseen advisory work in Mozambique, Guinea, Tanzania, Malawi, Namibia, and Timor-Leste. Mrs. Sachs, Lisa, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, Pedro. And let me also thank Ambassador Tenzin and Beth for those really helpful framing comments and useful updates and reminders. I'd also like to really thank FAO for giving us the opportunity to collaborate on such an interesting project. My colleagues and I had been thinking about the strategic use of incentives for a few years, and this afforded a really wonderful opportunity to apply this, frankly, critical analysis to one of the most important sectors with respect to sustainable development. We started this project, of course, before COVID, and already experts were calling for major transformations in land management and food systems to achieve the SDGs, and warning of the major financing gap for achieving the SDGs. As Beth noted, COVID really added to that urgency. It shined a really harsh light on the existing realities in our economic and food systems. It highlighted the severe disparities among and within countries in many respects, including in their resilience to such crises. And it also, as Beth said, set us even further back on the necessary SDG transformations on many critical goals, including food security and protecting biodiversity, reducing emissions, and others. We've moved further from our goals, not closer. But today, as we launch this report, many countries are focused on the recovery from COVID. And in particular, they are eager in that respect to attract investment and to support more investment from the private sector. As we've already heard, investment, as we obviously believe at CCSI, investment has an absolutely critical role to play in these transformations. But it's also absolutely important that we not simply restore the same practices and policies that were in place before COVID. Because well before COVID, our national economies and our global economy were contributing to widening inequalities, worsening pollution, devastating climate change, biodiversity loss. These challenges, of course, have been absolutely prevalent in large-scale land investments, also corruption, land grabs, tax avoidance, labor violations, and so on. Government policy, as Beth said, is decisive in aligning investment with the Sustainable Development Goals and in encouraging and shaping the types of investments that are aligned with and that contribute to sustainable development. The reason that we have been so interested in incentives is that they are very widely used, but they are very poorly understood, in my view, and therefore often poorly used. And when incentives are poorly designed, governments have lost tax revenue, they have supported harmful investments, they have contributed to regional races to the bottom, both in terms of fiscal policy and regulation. They increase the exposure of governments to lobbying and to corruption and more. But strategic and well-designed incentives can be useful policy tools to encourage and to support beneficial investments and activities. The process, the design, the implementation, the monitoring of incentives, these are all absolutely critical. And this is what this guide explores in great and valuable detail. One feature that I'd like to highlight, Beth did so rightfully, and I just want to underscore that the guide usefully features the broad range of the types of investors and the types of private sector activity. And I would also note we explore an extensive range of incentives that governments can usefully consider. I highlight this because often incentives are narrowly conceived as tax holidays or regulatory exemptions, for example. And similarly, the focus is largely on large foreign investors. But our guide makes the case for an increased focus on those who contribute the most to responsible agricultural investments, which are often small-scale producers, and explores the range of possible incentives. So let me not stand in the way of the discussion. I'm very proud of this very, very valuable guide and want to both congratulate and thank especially my colleagues at CCSI, Caitlin, LaDon, Anna, and Ella, and Yannick, and our partners at FAO who did all the work. The report, in my view, is a really valuable contribution to policymakers and to constituencies and to their supporters at such a critical time. Let me add my thanks to Beth for the wonderful panelists who are joining, many really good friends. I'm very grateful for your joining in this discussion and bringing your expertise, and for all of our participants who are, I hope, joining actively in the discussion now on social media and to us directly. So thank you once again, and for letting us learn from and with all of you.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I hope that we're going to bring some clarity into discussions as to these poorly understood, as you rightly said, incentives. This is, I mean, having read the guide, this is key. When we talk about targeting in particular, and we're coming again and again back into this targeting issue and incentives. But to understand this complexity, I think we need a framework. And this is where this first session of the now we're jumping into the first session of this webinar comes in. We should remind ourselves that this is these are the authors of the Guide on Incentive on Responsible Investment in Agriculture and Food Systems. And we will hear from Anna Bullman. Anna is a fellow of your institute, Lisa, CCSI. She has worked on issues related to agriculture and food systems for the civil society, academia, and international organizations. Then we will hear from LaDon Mehranwar. LaDon is a legal researcher at the CCSI. She has worked in academia with an NGO in Guatemala. Hablas español, I suppose. And in the private sector in Canada. Her work focuses on investment law and policy, human rights, and sustainable investment. And finally, we will hear from Yannick Fiedler. Yannick is a program officer at FAO. He coordinates projects that stimulate responsible investment in agri-food systems in North and West Africa, with a focus on young agri-entrepreneurs. He has authored several publications and analytical and capacity building tools on responsible investment. Yannick is a political economist by training and is also a good friend of mine. But we'll start with Anna. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Pedro. So I'll provide a brief overview of what are investment incentives and how the guide explains what the evidence says on how effective different types of investment incentives are. So in the guide, we provide a definition of investment incentives, and that can essentially be broken down to three elements. So the first is that it's a specific benefit. Secondly, given or offered by a government to an investor. And thirdly, in the hopes of influencing the investor to behave in a certain way. We looked at the different types of incentives that are being offered in the agriculture and food systems context, and then we grouped those into 5 broader sort of categories. The first of which is financial incentives. So those are non-tax-based support, such as grants or loans. The second is technical or business support incentives, and that can include things like facilitation services or extension services. The third is what we most commonly tend to think of when we think of investment incentives, and those are tax-based measures, so fiscal or tax incentives. The fourth is regulatory incentives, so derogations from national or subnational regulations or favourable regulatory terms offered to investors. And the fifth is other incentives, and those are measures that we categorised as incentives for the purposes of the guide, but didn't necessarily fit into the other 4 categories, and they can include things like public procurement schemes or new and targeted infrastructure. So in creating this guide, we wanted to put something together that was very practical for policymakers, something for them to be able to click to when considering a particular type of incentive to see what it is and how useful it is. And what we came up with is what we call the traffic light system. So what we did is categorize the different types of incentive into this traffic light system, with red incentives being those that are inefficient or carry an excessive risk of negative externalities. Those that are amber being good or bad, depending on how they're used. And then those that we classified as green incentives were more likely to yield positive investment outcomes, albeit still with risks of negative externalities if not carefully designed. So this is sort of a snip of what the guide, what I'm talking about when I say the traffic light system. And here we're looking at an example of a green incentive in the form of technological packages. Now you don't have to read all the content on the screen. Let me just dive into some of the basic details. So in terms of what a technological package is, it could maybe comprise of something like some special seeds and some composting equipment combined with some training. The pros of this type of incentive are that it can provide really essential training and inputs for small-scale producers, and it can encourage environmentally friendly agriculture. The cons with this type of investment incentive are that it can have limited benefits if the inputs are not well suited to the investor's needs. So here's an example from the guide of an amber incentive. So that's grants or cash or input subsidies. So these are direct financial transfers to investors for expenses or inputs. They can be very beneficial for small-scale producers in terms of being able to enter the market or increase productivity or remain economically viable. And they can also have very positive environmental benefits. For example, these tend to be used quite widely in the context of payments for ecosystem services. However, the risks that come with using grants or cash or input subsidies are that it can cause environmental harm. Say, for example, fertilizer is subsidised and then that encourages excessive use. They may also risk unsustainable use of resources, and there also runs a risk of corruption and cronyism if not carefully monitored. Finally, an example of what we classified as a red incentive are tax holidays. So a tax holiday is a complete exemption from paying tax for a certain period. It's very appealing in the sense that it's easy to offer, and it's relatively easy in terms of its design and administration. However, there is a long list of cons, a few of which are that it can result in significant loss of revenue and can be quite a blunt instrument. For example, the evidence shows that tax holidays don't necessarily encourage capital investment, and they don't necessarily encourage domestic partnerships. So that's just a brief overview of the traffic light system, and now I'll hand the floor over to Laudan.
Thank you, Anna. Can everyone hear me fine? Yes, okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
Right. Thank you to all participants and panelists who are here with us today. So the last substantive section of the guide, which is part 4, takes the information presented in the first 3 sections and provides a framework for policymakers considering the use of incentives for responsible investment in agriculture and food systems. The guide provides guidance for all stages of investment incentives illustrated in this graphic, from planning an intervention to designing the incentive, implementing it, and finally monitoring and evaluating the performance and impact of the incentive. In the guide, we suggest an adaptive approach to incentives, which implies a consistent effort to adapt incentives based on learnings from monitoring and evaluating, so that you can increase the likelihood that such incentives will support the desired outcomes. So in the interest of time, I'm going to discuss only one of these sections, the most critical stage of the framework, which is the planning stage. Before any specific incentive is designed and administered, the guide emphasizes the need for careful planning to help clarify whether an incentive is in fact an appropriate intervention. For instance, governments may find it easier to offer tax incentives to large foreign investors to attract FDI than to improve physical infrastructure locally, or implement economic reforms, or provide a more stable political environment, even if strengthening these enabling conditions is more critical for attracting and supporting responsible investments. both by domestic and foreign investors and producers. So to avoid granting and renewing incentives that are ineffective, inefficient, unimpactful, or just contrary to national development priorities, it's very important to plan carefully before designing and handing out incentives. So we have a framework for the planning section. The first step in the planning section is a context analysis. And the goal really is to figure out what the needs are or what the barriers to investments are and the causes of those barriers for a target population of agricultural investors or producers. Given the great diversity among agricultural producers, different interventions may be necessary to match different needs. For instance, in the case of established, more commonly male, small-scale producers, there may be no need to attract them to agriculture, but rather to stimulate investments that allow them to conduct their activities more sustainably and productively. Women producers, on the other hand, face different barriers to increased agricultural investment, such as unequal access to education and information, and weaker individual and collective agency. So that population is likely to benefit from targeted support that recognizes the social and economic barriers that women producers face specifically. Second, armed with that information, a theory of change is developed. And here, like in the previous step, we emphasize the critical role that agricultural investors themselves and the affected community at large, whenever relevant, may play to inform this effort. So the goal in this step is to articulate the desired impact that a potential intervention intends to address, and to map a pathway of change that could lead to that desired impact. Third, once developed, the theory of change can help policymakers, together with agricultural investors, explore different options, including the use of incentives, to find the most appropriate intervention for the problems identified and the impact sought. In cases where an investment incentive is identified as the most appropriate intervention, consideration should then be given to the best type of incentive to provide, including whether to undertake complementary actions or to provide incentive packages, which will really depend on a number of factors like the impact sought, the target beneficiaries, the available budget, which is a critical factor, and the capacity to administer and enforce the incentive, among other factors. And finally, if an incentive is chosen as the most appropriate intervention, it's important to then allocate roles and responsibilities among relevant government entities and local agencies. So after the planning stage, the guide provides a number of important considerations to take into account when designing and implementing investment incentives, including an annex which focuses specifically on designing tax incentives for the limited context in which they're deemed appropriate. And the final stage of the framework is another very critical stage, and that's the monitoring and evaluating of incentives, which can really deepen insight into whether progress is being made by the use of an incentive towards the stated goal. And together, monitoring and evaluation drive learning, which is ongoing. Learning can help inform, adjust, and improve current and future incentive design and implementation, and to support a decision to withdraw or discontinue an incentive altogether. And with that, I will now pass the floor to Yannick. Thank you.
Okay, I hope now you can see my screen. Thank you very much, Ladan. So we have just learned about the useful guidance the guide provides if you wish to plan, design, implement, monitor, and evaluate incentives for responsible agricultural investment. And let us now see how the guide can support such a process The guide recognizes that governments may wish to provide incentives for different types of investors. So I will use a very practical example, which is featured prominently in the guide: the provision of incentives that work for MSMEs and small-scale producers. So I will provide a very simplified idea of what the guide would recommend in terms of approaches and possibilities. So first of all, quite obviously, what we do know is that you would want to engage in a very inclusive way with all relevant stakeholders during the context analysis and design phase, as well as in the monitoring and evaluation phase of incentives. And the guide provides very practical recommendations here on how to do so, including how to address specific constraints and power imbalances that may affect small-scale producers, youth, and women, so that they can participate effectively in multi-stakeholder dialogue on questions that concern them. Next is part of the context analysis. Then we do imagine that you identify the barriers to responsible agriculture investment for MSMEs, small-scale producers, and other types of investors. Now, let us imagine that as part of our national sustainable development strategy, we figure that we do need to empower youth-led SMEs to invest responsibly in agriculture and food systems. And that the reason why their investments don't materialize is, amongst others, that they lack access to financial services. So this would be the key barrier. That then we would have an underlying cause, which would be imperfect capital markets and age-based biases against young agri-entrepreneurs, just because they have a shorter history of interactions with banks, less guarantees, and other factors. So as a solution, as was mentioned before, we could imagine incentives such as concessional or non-concessional loans by government or loans guarantees. So as a next step, using the guide, we would go back to this traffic light system that Anna has presented, and we'd look at different opportunities in terms of incentives, right? And here is the case of loans guarantees. So we have a description of what it is. It is promised by government to assume the debt obligation of the farmer in the event of default. We have a look at the different potential pros, and here we find specifically how these loan guarantees can enhance access to finance to small-scale producers who commonly lack access to commercial banks, such as young agri-entrepreneurs and women. And we also see a few potential cons and words of caution that we, of course, make in the context of the guide. For example, that financial institutions must exist and they must be available even in the more remote regions so that the loan guarantees can function. Now, what is very good about the guide is that it provides very practical empirical evidence and inspiration from case studies from all over Africa and the Middle East. And I'm very, very glad that we have Mrs. Inji Dogi from the Tunisian Agricultural Investment Promotion Agency today with us, because one of our case studies actually that features prominently in the guide comes from Tunisia. Then finally, the guide provides a series of very practical overarching considerations that need to be considered in terms of incentives that work for MSMEs and small-scale producers. And I just provide a few examples. One of them is that incentives may work best as packages for MSMEs. So what does that mean? It means that if you do provide loans or loan guarantees, you may wish to consider offering, in addition to that, training on financial education so that young agri-entrepreneurs know how to apply for loans and how to use a loan that is granted productively. And in some cases, and this was mentioned before by Ladan, incentives need to be complemented by broader changes in legal, regulatory, and normative frameworks. For example, when you seek to empower women farmers by offering them inputs and training, what may happen is that once the land and the crops become more valuable and productive, if there is no adequate safeguards in place, the more powerful members of the community, often older men, may drive the women off the land. So it's very important to avoid these kinds of adverse side effects and to analyze very carefully what else may be needed in complement to those incentives. With this, thank you very much for your attention. We have posted the link to the guide in the chat, and we will of course also share the presentations with all the attendees, since I've seen that this was being requested. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna, Ladan, and Yannick. I've been trying to follow the questions that have been raised in the chat and the Q&A. Some very interesting perspectives. One of them asked about how come the FAO doesn't work with the private sector. I said, yes, we work with the private sector. Of course we do. We engage. The whole idea is to mobilize private sector investment, because we just can't do this alone. And that is the actual nature of the engagement that the UN Committee on World Food Security has when it brings in the private sector mechanism and the civil society mechanism in its deliberations, and then in the endorsement of those voluntary instruments that we produce by both the civil society and the private sector. This is a joint venture, so to speak. Of course, it all depends on how you define work. Whether these include financial transactions, well, no, this is a very complicated issue that we shouldn't really be discussing at this stage. Of course, we are not going to accept financial as a UN organization financial contributions, but that doesn't mean that we can't work together. And we do indeed engage with the private sector, and we want to do more with the private sector, actually. Another question that has been raised also during the presentations by Lisa and Beth is this issue of targeting incentives. And I remember I was in the negotiations of the RAI principles, the CFS RAI principles. And one of the agreements there between private sector, CSM, and UN organizations in these principles for responsible agricultural investment is that incentives should not be discriminatory. Now, how do we reconcile these two from a legal and from a procedural point of view? And this is the question that I would like to put to you, Anna, Ladan, and Yannick. Over to you.
Who would like to go? Anna, do you want to go first? I see you were open.
No, I think you can go first, Yannick.
Okay, thank you, Pedro, for this excellent question, and also to all the attendees in the chat who are asking. From our perspective, what we think is really important is to consider the specific context, right? So when we say non-discriminatory, what does it mean? For us, I think what is important is that in many cases, we do find actual barriers to investment that are discriminatory, right? Let's get back to this example of the young agri-entrepreneur who, because of his lack of a collateral or his credit history, cannot access a loan from a commercial bank, right? So in this case, targeted incentives can be a mean to overcome a de facto discriminatory situation that exists because of information asymmetries, because of market imperfections, and to encourage private financial institutions to support investments by young agri-entrepreneurs through targeted incentives, right? So in this case, through incentives, we actually contribute to create a level playing field and to overcome discrimination that exists. So this would be my very own and personal answer to this very interesting question.
And I think that what Yannick says is, yeah, absolutely spot on. And it really emphasizes the importance of that planning stage, which Ladan really stepped us through nicely. And I think the other thing that really great question does emphasize is the need for this to be a constant evaluative process, adaptive process, like Ladan explained. So, you know, obviously from the outset, incentives need to very carefully be considered to whether they're going to address the barriers that the particular investor faces, but then as that is designed and then implemented, we need to be constantly asking, what is the effect that this incentive is having? And is it having the effect that we have sought? And so if, for example, in that context, a negative discriminatory effect is arising, then that design needs to be revisited again. And you can picture that circular image that Ladan stepped us through.
I don't have anything to add other than what has been said already. But yeah, I think it all depends. It's a balancing act. I think, and we sort of talk about this in the guide, it really depends on the target beneficiaries and the impact that is sought and what the barriers are. So as Yannick and Anna have said, you know, like the best example are youth. Like imagine a group of youth who have been educated, who have a bachelor's of science in agriculture, and they come back to the farm and they're without a job, they're unemployable because maybe they're a little bit more educated. So a package of or an incentive would be targeted to that group. And in that way, yes, it's discriminatory if you want to call it that, but it is targeted to that group of beneficiaries. And then there are ones that would be a lot more generalized, depending again on what the goal is and the jurisdiction you are and the context and everything. So it's very context specific.
Thank you. There is another interesting question here, which is actually, I did think about this quite a lot before. It's what does the guide recommend about regulatory incentives to filter out irresponsible large-scale commercial agricultural investments and to minimize and resolve negative impacts? Now, do incentives play a role as tightening rules? And the bottom line here is we want to boost responsible investment. And that is the difficulty. Of course, we want more investment. We want the right type of investment. And of course, there is a role in regulation to stop investment that is not sustainable or gives negative impacts on rural communities, on the environment, on society. Of course, there is a role. But the difficulty and the challenge that we're trying to do here in this ISIS work, and it's a difficult one, is how to boost responsible investment. I would, for the sake of time, I will actually move into the second session. And let me thank you for your contributions, by the way. Let me recall you that this session, we will hear from practitioners of incentives on responsible investment. And the first speaker is a French speaker. So I would remind you that actually we have interpretation into English. So you do that by looking at the toolbar at the bottom where it says interpretation. You can change the language there. So I would like to invite Ms. Angie Dougui, is the Director General of the Agency for the Promotion of Agricultural Investment in Tunisia. She is also the former Director General of the Regional Commissariat for Agricultural Development. And like me in the early days in academia in Uruguay, she's an agronomist. I would like to ask Mr. Dougui in her presentation to give a thought at what initiatives does AIPA carry out to support investment in agriculture in Tunisia? And in particular, could you please tell us about responsible investment and incentives for responsible investment for young agricultural entrepreneurs? And this is something that has actually been raised in the chat box. And so, Madame Dougui, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Pedro. Madame la Directrice Générale Adjointe de la FAO, chers participants, Mesdames et Messieurs, je suis honorée de présenter l'expérience de l'Agence de promotion des investissements agricoles en tant qu'institution d'appui aux investisseurs agricoles en général et aux jeunes promoteurs en particulier. Et je saisis cette occasion pour réitérer mes remerciements aux organisateurs, en particulier aux représentants de la FAO, de l'attention accordée à nos efforts quant à l'accompagnement des jeunes futurs entrepreneurs pour la concrétisation de leurs idées de projet. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de présenter l'Agence de promotion des investissements agricoles. En effet, la mission essentielle de l'APIA est la promotion d'un investissement privé, durable, responsable, innovant, attractif et de qualité pour atteindre plusieurs objectifs, à savoir l'augmentation de la valeur ajoutée, de la compétitivité et aussi l'augmentation de l'exportation, la création de l'emploi et surtout l'emploi des jeunes et la promotion de la compétence des ressources humaines, un développement régional intégré et équilibré et la réalisation d'un développement durable. Et les encouragements de l'État et la vocation de l'APIA ont fait de l'accompagnement un outil essentiel pour promouvoir et pérenniser les investissements des agri-entrepreneurs, c'est-à-dire des agripreneurs. Convaincus de l'importance de la formation des jeunes futurs entrepreneurs dans la gestion dans le secteur, l'APIA donc a mis au point des programmes de formation aussi bien techniques que de gestion et de marketing pour attirer les jeunes pour qu'ils investissent dans le secteur agricole. Mais cependant, on a remarqué qu'un nombre assez élevé de ces jeunes rencontrent des difficultés post-création, vu le manque de suivi régulier qui pourra les orienter et donc les aider à réussir leur installation. De ce fait, donc, et pour pallier aux insuffisances observées du programme de formation de ces jeunes, l'APIA a opté à la formation des accompagnateurs, donc des coachs accompagnateurs, pour un meilleur encadrement et accompagnement de ces jeunes afin qu'ils réussissent leur projet. Et c'est ainsi donc fut créé le réseau des accompagnateurs. En effet, en 2002, il y a eu l'expérience des pépinières. Un réseau donc de pépinières des entreprises agricoles a été créé pour appuyer et encourager les diplômés de l'enseignement supérieur. Ce réseau est composé de 7 incubateurs hébergés dans les établissements de l'enseignement supérieur touchant plus de 17 spécialités. Durant leur hébergement dans la pépinière, qui peut même atteindre 24 mois en fonction des spécialités du secteur, des incubateurs, des encadreurs scientifiques et aussi des experts sont mis à la disposition de ces jeunes diplômés. Une fois l'idée de projet a pris forme, après tout un process d'idéation, d'un business model Canva et de prototypage, un business plan est établi pour accompagner et soutenir le jeune futur entrepreneur durant le financement et la phase du démarrage du projet, qui est la phase la plus difficile. Donc, toujours à l'écoute de ces jeunes et partant du fait que le rajeunissement du secteur agricole est une opportunité pour une agriculture attractive et innovante, l'APIA s'est orientée vers un accompagnement personnalisé. Un projet donc ambitieux qui prévoit la mise en place d'un mécanisme moderne d'accompagnement au profit de ces agriculteurs. Et ce, en créant l'objectif 670 cellules territoriales d'accompagnement personnalisées par des jeunes ingénieurs agronomes. Son objectif est d'une part, l'objectif de ce projet ambitieux, la modernisation et la relance de l'investissement de 10 000 exploitations agricoles. Donc, notre objectif, c'est relancer l'investissement de 10 000 exploitations agricoles et aussi la création d'un centre de ressources, conseil et formation composé de 670 accompagnateurs conseillers et 48 accompagnateurs conseillers référents. Ces accompagnateurs vont aider les agriculteurs à élaborer leur dossier d'investissement, donc leur relation aussi avec les administrations, leur plan d'action, les aider à remplir les formalités administratives, à lancer leurs projets et assurer aussi le suivi pendant les 3 premières années de démarrage, qui sont, comme j'ai dit avant, c'est les années les plus difficiles et aussi les plus importantes pour la pérennité du projet. Par ailleurs, et afin de soutenir les investissements responsables et renforcer la participation des jeunes dans le secteur agricole, un pôle agri-accélérateur aux jeunes a été mis en place pour soutenir un groupe de jeunes agripreneurs à réaliser leur investissement dans la filière. On a choisi 2 filières, la filière laitière ovine et la filière huile d'olive du nord-ouest tunisien. Le projet, c'est-à-dire ce projet d'agri-accélérateur, cherche à appuyer les jeunes agripreneurs dans le domaine de l'entrepreneuriat agricole, l'agroalimentaire et les services liés à ces 2 secteurs, avec une focalisation sur l'innovation et la chaîne de valeur. En effet, le projet est basé essentiellement sur l'huile d'olive de Tborsor, qui est une région à Béja, qui bénéficie d'une appellation d'origine contrôlée, et le fromage des brebis sicilosardes, dont le cahier de charge est fini actuellement. Par ailleurs, le projet adoptera une approche régionale qui met en relief les 2 régions en mettant l'accent sur ces 2 produits de chaîne de valeur cités. Cette approche permet d'offrir une approche, donc d'offrir à ces territoires ruraux des perspectives de développement à la fois durable et inclusif. Les attendus du projet est de responsabiliser 1000 jeunes de la région de Tborsok, du gouvernorat de Béja, dont 200 jeunes sont déjà initiés à la création d'entreprises sous forme individuelle ou sous forme groupée, c'est-à-dire soit des SAMASA, des sociétés mutuelles et services agricoles, ou bien GDA, groupement de développement agricole. Donc, dans toujours une logique de filière agricole et de chaîne de valeur. Comme j'ai dit, la filière l'huile d'olive et l'élevage ovin, de développement régional. Parmi les résultats, ces jeunes sensibilisés, nous comptons déjà des résultats préliminaires. On a 100 jeunes, quand on dit 100 jeunes, ça peut être individuel ou groupé en SAMASA ou en GDRA, ont suivi la phase idéation et concrétisation, donc BMC première version. 20 jeunes individuels ou groupés ont bénéficié d'un accompagnement personnalisé pour achever et finaliser leur BMC et leur plan d'affaires. 20 jeunes ont bénéficié d'une mise en relation avec les partenaires financiers et l'APIA pour boucler leur schéma de financement, et 20 jeunes ont bénéficié d'un accompagnement personnalisé pour la réalisation de toutes les étapes de leur projet. Aussi, il est important à ce stade de voir le cadre juridique, c'est-à-dire de citer les encouragements accordés par l'État pour cette catégorie de promoteurs, c'est-à-dire les promoteurs jeunes. En effet, dans le cadre de la nouvelle loi d'investissement, une panoplie d'instruments d'encouragement de l'État à travers l'APIA est offerte aux investisseurs agricoles et aux jeunes agriculteurs, en particulier et notamment le crédit foncier, qui est un avantage accordé par l'État pour les jeunes agriculteurs et les diplômés des écoles supérieures d'agriculture. Lorsqu'on dit jeunes promoteurs, c'est-à-dire moins de 40 ans. Permettant donc, ce prêt foncier permet d'acquérir des terrains agricoles et de promouvoir donc des projets de développement et de projets intégrés, et ça permet bien sûr de rajeunir les exploitations agricoles, car la moyenne d'âge des agriculteurs en Tunisie dépasse largement les 50 ans. Donc, cet outil permettra de rajeunir le secteur agricole. Aussi, on n'oublie pas les avantages financiers et fiscaux accordés aux investisseurs du secteur pour promouvoir l'investissement agricole. En l'occurrence, donc, accorder une prime allant jusqu'à de 50 à 60% du volume d'investissement selon la catégorie et le montant d'investissement. Aussi, réduire le coût d'investissement en réduisant les droits de douane pour l'acquisition des équipements à l'importation ou leur exonération de la TVA en cas d'acquisition locale et l'exonération de l'impôt sur le bénéfice des sociétés ou le revenu des personnes physiques, et ce, pendant 10 ans. Et la prise en charge par l'État de la contribution patronale à régime légal de la sécurité sociale pour les jeunes diplômés pendant les 5 premières années d'activité. Donc, il y a une panoplie d'instruments et des lois, que ce soit, et des incitations financières et fiscales pour encourager les promoteurs et surtout les promoteurs jeunes à faire des projets dans le secteur agricole ou bien de la pêche ou bien les services liés à ces secteurs ou bien la première transformation. Et avant de finir, je voudrais vous faire part de la nouvelle plateforme de formation en ligne, le e-learning, que nous avons conçue pour la mettre à la disposition de certaines catégories de jeunes, leur permettant ainsi d'accéder, donc c'est un outil innovant qui permet à ces jeunes d'accéder à un espace d'échange, d'expérience et de connaissances dans les secteurs et à un éventail de MOOCs, d'ateliers et de cours pour apprendre à devenir entrepreneur. Une autre fois, j'en profite de cette occasion pour remercier les organisateurs d'avoir accordé de l'importance à nos efforts déployés afin donc de rendre le secteur agricole plus attractif à travers l'accompagnement de nos jeunes, que ce soit diplômés ou non diplômés. Et merci pour votre attention et thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Migui. There's an echo on my mic. Thank you. Yes, very interesting, very ambitious. And as I was listening to you, I was also monitoring the chat, and I think that the question there would be, how did you get there, right? Because this is about partnerships and understanding at national level that there are some sectors that are priority, and how did you get there? How did you get to design a program that is so broad and so ambitious? But unfortunately, we're running out of time. I would like to invite Mr. Bocian Scalar, is the Executive Director, CEO of the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, WIPA. It's the umbrella organization of worldwide investment promotion agencies. It was established in Geneva in 1995 under the auspices of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. He has over 20 years of management experience and is a global leader in investment promotion with a focus on the private sector. His vast experience in different fields from the private to public sector give him and us the opportunity to hear a global overview of the current business and geopolitical trends that influence the flows of FTI. Allow me to ask you, as you go through your presentation, how is WIPA supporting its members in creating and implementing incentives for responsible agricultural investment? And how can this guide that we have in front of us be useful to you and your members? Mr. Scalar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And of course, thank you as well to the organizers of this, I would say, brilliant also set of webinars, because I used to participate in one of the previous one as well. And I definitely believe, just in the beginning, to say that this guide would definitely, especially reading a bit more in details prior to this meeting, and as well today listening to the presenters, would definitely help the investment promotion agencies. But let me start like this, that investment promotion agencies are not necessarily being focused on the, for example, agricultural investments. Some of them, yes, some of them not. And in general, these are, I would say, bodies that are among the investors and governments. And these are, of course, sensitive issues. And they have an enormously big number of tasks that they are following in their day-to-day jobs. And they are not just, of course, focusing on the incentives. Many of them, this should be said here, are not dealing with incentives at all. And their, I don't know, ministries or any other institutions are responsible for incentives. But nevertheless, we as an umbrella organization, as you clearly stated, are actually here to help to our members, at least to try to understand what are the trends, what are, let's say, the ideas of incentives. And nevertheless, without keeping in mind only agricultural investments, we always have a statement to our members that incentives are just the cherry on the cake. So they should not be the main factor of, let's say, attracting investors. And of course, first, they need to be sure that they prioritize the sectors. They know which sectors are the priority. So if they decided, and I saw in some chat, I guess in chat before, that necessarily the governments doesn't always support these ideas. So they should have a full mandate. So this is one of our tasks, to support investment promotion agencies in the eyes of their government, advocating to their governments, of course, especially for the proper sector prioritization, which is in line with SDGs, which goes into the ideas that was spoken today. So let's say no poverty, zero hunger, and taking care of the climate as well, being cautious of, let's say, not exploitation of the, let's say, workforce, or breaching the human rights. So the idea is that IPAs, their role is a very important one, especially in the advocacy level, which many times they are not able to do. So when hearing, let's say, from investors, what they are willing to do, what is their purpose, for example, when investing in agri-sector, what they would like to get it. It's not only incentives, it's first of all, many times we see it's the business environment, are the laws and bylaws, what we heard as well from the presenters before. And hopefully we are enough, let's say, helping to our members to be able, let's say, to give a feedback to their governments, what is missing, for example, in this particular area, what needs to be done prior to giving the incentives. And I guess this guide that is in front of us is an excellent example that any IPA, but particularly I would suggest that this is also given to the governments, which are the principals of these institutions, investment promotion agencies, or whatever you call them in the particular country, so that they are aware of these ideas. Because the biggest issue, what we see, is discrepancy between what is promised by the investment promotion agency towards investors, and what is in reality in place as a law or bylaw or regulation, or what is later given. And on the other hand, of course, protecting the government, that the investors, when they promise some certain, let's say, contribution to environment, contribution to the social environment, employ new people, that they also commit, of course, not to abuse the human rights and other things. And of course, if IPA sees some potential, let's say, threats, that of course they inform their governments, so to be prepared for this, and then maybe to incorporate into the new regulations or laws this kind of threats, let's say. And of course, we as VIPA, as I say, we are not focusing particularly on the sectors, but nevertheless, our main task is to equip our members, to equip investment promotion agencies with certain knowledges, and at least encourage them to follow this kind of guidelines, or this kind of, let's say, papers that are produced, or books or guides, to be able to be prepared for the future, especially now. The pandemic actually negatively impacted all the investments, and you all know that it went drastically, more than 40%. It fell the global FDI, and of course, especially least developed countries or lesser developed countries that are, I would say, more focused on, let's say, agricultural sector, need this kind of support. And not only, let's say, from us as an umbrella organization. We are lucky that we have a very strong consultative board, which consists of all these big institutions like United Nations, World Bank, OECD, Chamber of Commerce, and everything. So they also advocate in the name of the investment promotion agencies and try to link the investors' needs with what governments are offering and what then investment promotion agencies can, let's say, mediate. They are, let's say, mediators between the governments and the private sector to reach the best possible investments into, okay, if we speak now into the agricultural sector. So I would stop here, not to be too long. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. No, you were not too long, and I was very interested to continue listening to what you were saying. We have about 10 minutes in which we would like to ask you and Madame Duguy a question, and then we will give the floor to Lorenzo for his concluding remarks. But quickly, I mean, Madame Duguy, the question here, which comes from the chat, is how do you actually attract those young agri-entrepreneurs? I mean, the project is going on. How do you do this? How do you do this? Over to you.
D'accord. Ici, à l'Agence de promotion des investissements agricoles, on a un groupe cible, donc ces jeunes promoteurs qu'on veut les attirer dans le secteur agricole, vu, comme j'ai dit, que ce secteur avant n'est pas attractif pour ce genre de promoteurs. Donc, on cherche à l'APIA, vu la vision de l'APIA qui est donc elle se positionne l'agence comme catalyseur de tout ce qui est innovation dans son écosystème. Donc, on veut attirer disons, les jeunes au niveau de ces secteurs. Comment on fait donc pour attirer ces jeunes? Bien sûr, par des journées de sensibilisation. À travers, par exemple, on a fait un projet d'agripreneur avec la GIZ. On a fait donc des ateliers d'idéation pour ces jeunes, c'est-à-dire lorsque ce jeune il a une idée bien précise ou même il a quelques idées, donc à travers ces ateliers d'idéation, cette idée deviendra une idée mûre et donc il pourra parler de cette idée, il pourra faire un pitch, après donc un accompagnement, plutôt une incubation, que ce soit dans les pépinières ou même au niveau des différents ateliers. Donc, il y aura donc toute la phase de l'idéation et puis il commence à préparer son BMC, Business Model Canva. De cette, il y a tout un process disons, ce process qui, plus ou moins, entre guillemets, qui attire les jeunes et surtout, lorsque ces jeunes veulent promouvoir plutôt entreprendre dans des secteurs innovants et ils veulent être toujours, comme on le sait, connectés. Donc, tout ce qui est innovation les attire et ces ateliers pourra les encourager à continuer et faire ces projets innovants tels que, par exemple, on a vu que ces jeunes sont trop attirés par tout ce qui est des plateformes numériques, sont trop attirés par tout ce qui est l'irrigation intelligente, smart agriculture. Et lorsqu'il s'agit de promoteurs diplômés, donc il y a d'autres parcours et peuvent entreprendre des startups. On a en total 500 startups dans le domaine agricole, dont 25 startups PAC sont labellisées et on est en train de digitaliser tout le nombre de ces startups pour aussi les pousser à faire Startup Act, c'est-à-dire une labellisation de leur startup aussi. En tant qu'APIA, on est en train d'organiser, on va organiser, on a lancé un formulaire dans Google On est en train donc de rassembler aussi bien les startups et aussi les agriculteurs potentiels pour les mettre en contact. Aussi, ces rencontres et ce réseautage permettra à d'autres jeunes d'adhérer à ce secteur, à l'agriculture, au secteur agricole. On n'oublie pas, bien sûr, il y a tel que et j'ai dit dans mon intervention, j'ai parlé des avantages spécifiques pour les jeunes qui sont, par exemple, le crédit foncier. Le prêt foncier n'est accordé que pour les jeunes promoteurs, c'est-à-dire ceux qui ont moins de 40 ans. Le prêt foncier, c'est un crédit qui est très encourageant. Il est sur 25 ans avec un taux d'intérêt de 5% et un délai de grâce de 7 ans. Donc cet avantage, il est accordé pour les jeunes. Et aussi, on a un autre mécanisme qui est le mécanisme de l'eau technicien. C'est pour les techniciens ou les ingénieurs agronomes, aussi pour rajeunir ce secteur et surtout pour plus de technicité, parce que ces techniciens peuvent avoir des projets pilotes, donc ils peuvent rayonner dans toute la région. S'il y a je crois que j'étais pas très longue.
I think I can't hear anymore. I think my transmission was cut for some reason. So let me proceed with the then. Thank you very much, Madam. And we will then ask a short question. I would like you to be concise, because we are running out of time and we want to hear what Lorenzo has to say. We always want to hear what Lorenzo has to say, and we're waiting for him. And but your contribution also, there is a question here. There is how, from your perspective, can the CFSRI principles be used more widely and effectively to drive responsible investment in agriculture and food systems? And this is actually a question that also has to do with Julian when he mentions about the political side of this equation. If you could share some thoughts with us, we would be grateful. Thank you very much. Sorry, that question was for you, Mr. Scalar, if you're still with us.
I thought you've been directing it to Mr. Lorenzo. Okay.
No. We have time for Lorenzo. We're waiting for him. Okay. It would be to you. How can we promote or use the CFSRI principles more widely?
I would say again like this. So the important is that the governments are aware of these things prior to their agencies, because, okay, I can speak in the name of the agencies. And we know that many times agencies are not really able to utilize the ideas that would be mentioned in this kind of, let's say, guides. So the idea is to promote through some events, any kind of events, of course. Particularly, the predecessor was speaking about making some events for startups and everything that they encourage them to use this. But in a global level, first there should be political consensus. And you mentioned this. For example, we can see clearly that SDG commitment is the first, that is the most important, that the government really commit to sustainable development goals, which this guideline supports 100%. And then, of course, sustainable investments is one of the things that we are trying to advocate. For example, we did recently with the World Bank, we launched an, let's say, advocacy award. So I can't say particularly in agricultural sector, but the idea of making, awarding the agencies that helped their governments to create an environment, business environment, let's say investment environment, the laws, regulations, with a reform that enables to their economies to get, let's say, better and sustainable investments, not just any kind of. But then we come to the idea that especially, let's say, least developed countries, many times when we ask them, would you be willing to consider SDGs? Would you be willing, let's say, to go into the investments and maybe incentivize the sustainable investments? They will tell me, or they will tell us, look, the minister or the government requests from us investments, considering this low level of global investments now. And the least developed countries are also suffering. It's not only developed that are suffering current drop of the global FDI. And they would first search for any kind of investments, even if it doesn't follow the rules necessarily what are, let's say, mentioned in this particular guide, or any kind, either guide for any other sectors. So I guess the idea is, in a global level, through the institutions that I mentioned as well before, to promote the idea of sustainability, of SDGs, of a big importance of building back better, especially now after the COVID, and especially in the sustainable sectors, and especially in the vulnerable sectors like agricultural sector is in reality. So the idea is to persuade the government. So I again have this message that first, the governments should be persuaded that these things, like this kind of guides, are very valuable. And then, of course, empowerment of investment promotion agencies, that they are able to use this kind of guidelines in their day-to-day work. And on the other hand, I must commend to big institutions like United Nations or World Trade Organization that recently are putting more attention to business community, giving them the floor to be from the beginning part of the discussion, being a stakeholder, co-creating the rules and regulations. For example, as well in OECD, let's say the responsible business conduct, in ILO, responsible, let's say, employment issues and all this. So all these initiatives should be supported as well from the investor side, because if they incorporate the ideas in their own business plans, and we know that the business plans of the private sector are much, much more deep and much, much long-term than from the governments. And they all focus on the return back, of course, and they focus on the KPI, so the key performance indicators. So they should also get something. And of course, incentives are one thing that maybe encourage them to invest into this kind of sectors or be cautious and mindful of these regulations, but not necessarily, as I said before. So the business environment and the investment climate should first support this idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Scalar. And now it's your turn, Lorenzo. Lorenzo, let me remind you that Lorenzo is a principal researcher in law and sustainable development at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED. Lorenzo, you got the floor.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation. It's an important discussion, particularly as extensive evidence highlights the role that effective state action can play in promoting desirable economic activities. And it's also helpful, I think, to complement the discussion of the guide as a normative instrument with very practical experiences of actually working on these issues. An incredibly rich discussion in the chat box, which is still continuing. It's impossible for me to do justice to this richness of discussion, but two questions really stayed with me. The first one is about the notion of investment. What is investment? Who are the investors? And very often private investment is equated to corporate activities. But I think from the beginning of the discussion, Lisa Sachs and several other speakers reminded us that smallholders are the main source of investment in agriculture worldwide. And the guide, I think, should be commented for engaging with this issue. For example, highlighting the role that small-scale young agri-entrepreneurs play. And Anna, Ladan, and Yannick also highlighted the need to consider social differentiation among small-scale investors, right, based on factors such as gender, age, etc., etc. We must recognize that there can be trade-offs between different investment policy approaches here. And as Ambassador Tiensin mentioned in his opening remarks, these issues are often inherently political, as well as raising complex technical challenges. So the first question really is around how we define investments and how that relates, the implications that can have for the way we look at incentives. The second question is about the place of incentives in public policy. There's an empirical dimension here, which several speakers alluded to. Do incentives work? What types of incentives? Under what conditions? And as the guide notes, the issue is not only whether incentives are effective in pursuing their stated policy objectives, but also their overall social, environmental, and economic costs and benefits. And I think considering the incentives in that holistic way seems a very helpful approach to me. There are also normative dimensions which relate to the complementarities with regulation, which Yannick and Bastian mentioned, and also Julian Kwan in the chat box, and several others. So the guide, I find, provides very helpful clarifications here in that international instruments primarily address respecting and protecting rights, human rights, tenure rights, labor rights, through safeguards and regulation rather than incentives. But incentives can be particularly relevant to the pursuit of policy objectives that also form part of the responsible investment agenda. For example, promoting more inclusive forms of business, maximizing employment opportunities for young people. And that point just now from Bastian on the importance of coordinated action at the international level to avoid a race to the bottom. So we're not just looking at national policy and national level solutions, but also more international dimensions. And finally, I found particularly helpful in the guide and also in some of these discussions, today, the institutional dimension. So quite often discussions about policy end with policy design, but of course, implementation strategies are key. Arrangements for continuous learning and reorienting policy are also important, and part 4 of the guide, which Ladan presented, and which also links to some of the more practical presentations in the second half of the session, I think are very helpful in bringing out the entire life cycle of the policies in relation to incentives. So from design stage to implementation to monitoring and evaluation. And I think that is a very helpful way in my mind for thinking through the process through which decisions can be made and affected both in policy and in practice. So I found this discussion very helpful, and I thank you for the opportunity to share these brief comments.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I was going to take the liberty of making some closing remarks, but actually looking at the discussions we had on the chat, all the contributions and the rich discussions, it would take me probably days to go through this and come up with something that makes sense and is intelligent. So I'm going to spare myself the humiliation and say, we're going to be closing the event now, and I would like all the presenters to switch on their cameras so we can have a group photo. And as we do so, I'd like to say thank you very much to the people behind this event, Teresa and people from information technology, the interpreters for their patience. And I apologize if sometimes we speak too rashly, but that's the reality of thought. Sometimes thoughts, you can't keep up with it. Thank you for the interpreters. The panelists, thank you to the panelists for all their contributions, and the audience for your attention and your questions and the debates. As Lorenzo said, there's very rich discussion still going on. I'm sure that if we leave this chat going on there, we will have a PhD dissertation by the end of the year. It's been a real pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you. And I wish you all a very good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.